Welcome, my friends, to the Sage of Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, Neil Sanders returns to the show. Neil is an expert on the subject of mind control and the techniques used within the Matrix to manipulate the thoughts, beliefs, and values of the unsuspecting masses. Neil discusses his new book, which is called Now is the Only Thing That's Real, which re-examines and revises the Charles Manson story by exposing the powerful plays and motives behind what really happened on August 8th, 1969. And so without further ado, here's the conversation with Neil. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Charles Manson and how you got started with the book? How did you begin to research this man?
Well, I mean, I just sort of got fascinated with it because the whole sort of concept of it, even the sort of the mainstream story, the story that you get in Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi, it's an incredibly compelling story. It sounds like it sounds like it's too good to be true. It's like almost the perfect horror story. This wily, bizarre, quasi-religious ex-con that somehow manages to drag all these beautiful young teens off to his, in inverted commas, commune to join his cult, and then manages to sort of persuade them to essentially do his bidding. At the same time, he's sort of touching base with various members of Hollywood and the music industry and such like that, or supposedly trying to sort of pry his way into this industry. And upon rejection of this, starts preaching an apocalyptic race war and gets his followers to enact murder in order to bring about this race war. And it just, to me, the whole concept of it was fascinating. And then what's strange is that the more you read into it, the more you seem to realize that there's a lot of strangeness that's going on in this case. There's what I would call like a secondary level of sort of understanding of the Manson case, which would be the sort of Ed Sanders and various other people version of Manson, which would be involving broader cults, attachments to the sort of Sam murders, attachments to the Process of Final Judgment, essentially, and the suggestion that perhaps there was something more nefarious, even suggestions made by people like Mae Brussel and other people that perhaps this was all part of some government operation, that this was something to create chaos, that this was in some way a setup. And then once you've sort of read into that, you start to discover that actually there's an even further layer, that some of this or the origins of that particular story come from a particularly shady operative involved with this whole milieu. And so you start to question that. And what I did was really I just ingested everything that was available from Manson. I read all the books, as many interviews as I could. I watched as many interviews as I could, and just tried to absorb as many facts about all the sort of main players that were involved in the case. And one of the main things to do was basically to learn how to decipher how Manson talks, because he sounds like a complete lunatic. Because that's a fair appraisal, to be fair. He's not a wise mystical shaman. He's a very, very devious criminal. He's essentially a pimp. Whether some of the more bizarre attributes are actually real is another question, basically. But once you actually sort of decipher him and learn how to sort of hear what he's saying in these interviews, he actually tells you an incredible amount. So what I then tried to do was basically get this into an order, try and write a timeline, because a lot of the books basically obfuscate the timeline. They sort of jump backwards and forwards and go all over the place. And once you actually sort of get all the incidents into a nice timeline, and you can track the progression of the various characters through his so-called family, his so-called followers, and the people that were connected to him, and you start to see exactly where and when these interactions took place, quite a different story actually arises, and it raises questions about how close he was to Hollywood, how close he was to the music industry, which appears to be incredibly close. It also basically raises questions about the nature of his so-called followers, who don't seem to be really followers at all, but actually a sort of loose cadre of people that come and go as they please. A lot of them get kicked out, a lot of them leave on their own accord, a lot of them just don't listen to Manson. Then when you start to look at the actual prosecution case, the creation of the helter-skelter race war, the concept of the connections to the Beatles, and find out where this came from, it casts even more doubt on all of these stories. Essentially, a lot of these came from witnesses that had something to gain. And again, if you track the way that Bugliosi, who was the DA who was prosecuting Manson, built his case, creating the motive for the killings and assigning blame, skipping from one material witness, Susan Atkins, to a different material witness who 30 seconds before the offer was made was on trial, facing the death penalty, and suddenly has a complete turnabout in her story. You start to see that essentially, wow, this was manufactured. This explanation was, for some reason, manufactured by the court. What was very strange was that at first it seems that basically they didn't want to solve the case. They certainly didn't want to get involved with uncovering any of the sort of seedier sides of it. They actually lost all the material evidence. The main evidence in the case was found by members of the public who were responding to essentially the newspapers. The police weren't that interested in solving the case. And when they found the murder weapon, they lost it.
Well, when you say they lost it, Neil, do you mean that they had it and it just disappeared, or they just overlooked it?
Essentially, it was for the gun that was used in the case, which, by the way, here's one of the things that sort of fascinate me. There's lovely little sort of like weirdness attached to everything. The gun that was used in the case, which is a .22 Buntline Special based on Wyatt Earp's famous firearm, that was used by Tex Watson to kill people at the Tate residence. It was stolen. It was essentially given to Charles Manson, who gave it to Tex Watson. Charles Manson was given it by a stuntman called Randy Starr. Randy Starr was given it to him by a young actor called Ronald Reagan, that then went on to be the governor of California and later the president of the United States of America. So it was Ronald Reagan's gun that actually was involved in the Tate massacre, which is, very, very strange. Also, there was a rumor that, which was proven to be true, that sex tapes involving the great and the good of Hollywood, some including Yul Brynner, Warren Beatty, Sharon Tate, Peter Sellers, Mama Cass, some in homosexual trysts, some in orgies, some suggestion that there was an element of bestiality that was going on in these as well. And these were found by the LAPD at Tate, at Cielo Drive.
This would be Sharon Tate's address?
Yeah, sorry, this is 10050 Cielo Drive, which was the home of Roman Polanski, which is the site of the first murder in the Tate LaBianca's.
Okay.
A gentleman called Gary Hinman had already been killed by Manson, or supposedly been killed by the Manson family. It was actually an argument with Bobby Bosley over some drugs, which is a running theme in this whole thing. But essentially, a gentleman called Hal Lipsett was a detective, and the LAPD tried to sell him these pornographic tapes, and one of them had Jane Wyman in it. Jane Wyman at the time was the wife of Ronald Reagan. So again, all of these weird sort of goings and forth just sort of like that weave themselves throughout the case. They're just fascinating to me, basically. The essential story, because a lot of people might not be completely au fait with it, is that essentially Manson had been in and out of prison all his life. He got out of jail in 1967 and went straight to the Haight-Ashbury district, and managed to sort of get himself a harem of young girls who were sort of turned on by his patter, his unique way of seeing the world, and essentially the music that he played, because he was a relatively accomplished guitarman and songsmith, and was hoping apparently to ingratiate himself into the music business. He was certainly playing at bars and busking and that type of thing, and trying to sort of get together with various people. One of the people that the family grew and grew. At one point, Manson found himself working at Universal Studios under a gentleman called Gary Strongberg as a favor, apparently, for one of his jailhouse buddies, his jailhouse buddy also went on to become the road manager of the Rolling Stones later on. So that's another strange connection. And basically got some jobs at Universal Studios, but it didn't really quite work out. And then later on, he went and managed to hook up with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys fame. Dennis Wilson was the drummer of the Beach Boys, and was actually the only member of the Beach Boys that could actually surf. The story is that basically they sort of strong-armed their way into Dennis Wilson's house, and slowly started to take over his life, took all his possessions, spent all his money, and kind of indoctrinated themselves into this cult, which was a sort of free-living, pansexual, vegetarian, Jesus quasi-satanic cult, according to the mainstream version of events. And when Dennis basically was reneged from them, or taken away from them by the Beach Boys management, they moved over to a ranch called the Spahn Ranch, which is in Chatsworth in California. Essentially, the Manson starts preaching about this race war that he feels is going to be the end of the world. It's going to be the black people against the white people. The black people will win, but Manson will go out into the desert, and there he will wait until there's 144,000 followers, and they will come back, and that they will take their rightful place as the leaders of the world, because essentially the black people, he felt, would not be able to cope with the rigors of running civilization. Unfortunately, whilst all this was going on, Bobby Beausoleil, who was one of the members of the group, goes off and, for whatever reason, kills a gentleman called Gary Hinman. The prosecution claimed that it was to go and get $20,000 that had been bequeathed to him so that they could start financing Helter Skelter, which was this apocalyptic race war. Following Bobby's arrest and the arrest of Mary Bruner and I've gone simple, and another of his followers, Manson essentially tells them to enact this race war, and so he sends Tex and Susan and Katie, who are three of his followers, along with Linda Kasabian, who's a relatively new adherent to this, in inverted commas, cult, along to the house where Terry Melcher used to live. The reason that they were attacking Terry Melcher is because Terry Melcher had apparently promised them a record contract or an in into the music industry. Terry Melcher claims that he'd only met Manson previously that year. We will learn actually that this is not true. Terry Melcher met and became friends with Charles Manson in 1968, which is a year before the mainstream claims.
And he was the son of Doris Day.
He was the son of Doris Day, yeah, absolutely. And he was basically friends with Dennis Wilson. He was the producer of bands like the Byrds, and very, very sort of essential to that scene. Him and Dennis Wilson and I believe Greg Jacobson, who was connected to the Beach Boys, had a group called the Golden Penetrators. And essentially their job, or their dead job, the point of this club was to sleep with as many girls as possible. And apparently they did pretty well.
Quite successful.
Yeah, incredibly successful. Yes. And so, this is why they apparently attacked Cielo Drive. There were Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate, along with Abigail Folger and her boyfriend Wojtek Frykowski, and these are all friends of Roman Polanski. Sharon Tate is pregnant with Roman Polanski's child. Roman Polanski is in London at the time, filming or trying to film a movie called The Day of the Dolphin, which is actually based on the MK Ultra experiments of John Lilly and involves talking dolphins. Unfortunately, he never gets to finish this film. The four of them are murdered, and along with an apparent wrong place at the wrong time, a gentleman called Stephen Parent. And the following night...
Who was the four that got murdered, Neil?
It was Abigail Folger and Wojtek Fukowski, who were a couple. Jay Sebring, who was a former boy, who was a hairdresser to the stars, but also had another job servicing other wares to the stars, and Sharon Tate, who was the wife of Roman Polanski, who was 8 months pregnant. And they were all killed, apparently, before midnight on Friday, August the 8th. Now, again, this we will learn is not true. They were actually killed much, much later, probably nearer to 3-4 in the morning. Also, if you read the police report, it doesn't tally with the prosecution's case in any way. It suggests something far, far different had actually happened. The following night, Manson goes out with Clem and Susan, Katie, Linda Kasabian, and Tex, and Van Houten as well, who's another Leslie Van Houten, who's a young girl that's basically was Bobby Beausoleil's girlfriend, and it's never really been quite explained why she was there. They go at random, apparently, to this place called the LaBianca's house, and just completely pick some random house. They go in, Manson and Tex tie them up. Manson leaves and goes with Linda Kasabian and Susan Atkins and Clem to find an actor called Saladin Nadir, but they can't find him, and so they abandon that. And in the meantime, Tex and Katie murder Rosemary LaBianca and Lino LaBianca in cold blood, and then hitchhike their way back to the Spahn Ranch. Following this, basically, they move into the desert to the Myers and Barker Ranch in order to prepare for this so-called impending apocalypse, although, strangely, Tex hightails it back to Texas and Katie hightails it back to Alabama, which is never really sort of like slightly incongruent with the concept of a cult, but never mind. And then, essentially, Manson is caught. They're caught for a car running ring. And they're essentially stealing cars and turning them into dune buggies for whatever reason. And basically, they've got this car chopping ring. They get arrested for that. And Susan Atkins starts confessing. She's basically tied back to the murder of Gary Hinman and immediately starts confessing. Well, I say immediately starts confessing. She immediately gets 2 high-priced lawyers who it is never explained who paid for them. And then immediately starts confessing. Very shortly after this confession is given in front of the grand jury. And then days after this confession is printed in the Los Angeles Times. This confession is then serialized as a novel called The Killing of Sharon Tate, which comes out before the trial starts. Then the trial starts. It goes on for over a year. The trial is slightly strange because basically the case is that Manson ordered the murders, therefore he is guilty. And he alone is guilty. But the other people who were under Manson's spell are also guilty because they did it under their own influence, which tends to contradict itself.
Yeah, and he never murdered anybody, right?
No, he didn't. He actually, he thought he'd killed a drug dealer called Bernard Crowe or Lotsa Papa, who essentially had been ripped off by Tex. Tex, this is the thing. Tex was not a good guy. Tex was a drug dealer and a rip-off merchant. He had a history of ripping drug dealers off and stealing money and drugs. This is what we're going to find, like, that basically these kids were not good kids that were turned bad by Manson. Susan Atkinson had very nearly gone to prison she'd been to prison and in psychiatric wards, and she'd pulled a gun on a policeman. Like, Clem had been to prison for drugs, Paul had been to prison for drugs, Tex had been in all sorts of trouble, but somehow managed to sidestep it, probably because his cousin was a police officer back in Texas, but he was a drug dealer. Katie was living with her heroin-addicted sister, and it suggested that she dabbled in heroin. Sandra Good was essentially a rich girl that was she kept going back to her dad. She went back to her dad and had a baby, and then went back to live on the ranch, which again slightly goes against the concept of a cult. But the trial went on for over a year, and the defence lasted for as long as it takes for them to say, "Thank you, Your Honour, the defendant's rest." The defence did not present a case. What happened was essentially Susan Atkins, just before the trial started, decided that she recanted her confession that she'd murdered Sharon Tate, and she'd drank the blood, and that she'd decided that she was going to cut the baby out of her stomach and take it back to the ranch and all of this. She recanted all of that and said that basically she'd been pressured into this by her lawyers and the DA, who said that if she didn't do this, she would be given the death sentence. Her death sentence was commuted to a pardon. Then essentially, because she recounted on it, she was given the death sentence again, and they went to Linda Kasabian, who was also one of the witnesses, and offered her an immunity deal if she would essentially parrot the exact same story. What is really strange is at the beginning of the case, there was no mention of Helter Skelter. There was no mention of an apocalyptic race war. There was no real mention of an obsession with the Beatles. This all started to come later. As other witnesses like Danny DiCarlo and Paul Watkins started to approach Vincent Bugliosi. Now, the thing about Danny DiCarlo is that essentially he was the person that gave Bobby Bosley the gun to kill Gary Hinman. He was the person that ordered Bobby Bosley to kill Gary Hinman. He was the head of this particular chapter of the Straight Satans Motorcycle Club. And the reason that Gary Hinman was killed was because he'd sold the Straight Satans $1,000 worth of bad mescaline. So Danny DiCarlo was incredibly connected to the case. He also basically had in his possession the sword that was used by Manson to slash Gary Hinman across his face. So why his testimony was taken as credible is beyond belief, essentially. And similar to stories with Paul Watkins and Barbara Hoyt, who were the other material witnesses for the prosecution, their witness statements are riddled with holes. Essentially, what these two were doing was trying to get some attention because they were on the television.
Yeah.
So that is exactly it. That's the mainstream story. To say that the real story is quite different. And so the starting thing that's very different is that, I say, these kids weren't really like good kids turned bad. In a lot of cases, Manson was actually quite beneficial. He certainly got Katie off heroin. He was trying to get Tex and Susan off methadone and speed and stuff like that, and banned them from the ranch, kicked them off the ranch when they were using it. It's not. Don't get me wrong. Manson is not a good guy. Manson is a hardened criminal, and if he wasn't in prison for what he's in prison for, he should be in prison anyway. But the actual sort of the truth of the story is quite different. I mean, one of the main things. Well, just to sort of like just because a lot of people are going, okay, well, give us an example then. This whole concept of a race war came from a guy called Krishna Venter, who was actually a real cult leader that was in Box Canyon in California in the 50s. And he essentially, everything that was ascribed to Manson and the family was essentially stolen from the life of Krishna Venter. He believed in pansexuality. He believed that he was Jesus. He also believed that he was the devil at the same time. He believed that he was the Messiah and that there was going to be a race war between the blacks and the whites, and that he and his followers would go out into the desert and hide there in the mountains until this race war came across. They would swell their numbers to 144,000, and he would come back to the world and take his rightful place as leader. He also used to do crucifixion rituals at Box Canyon. Now, here's a very interesting thing, because this was something that was subscribed to Manson. They said that he hung on this cross at Box Canyon, and also that Paul Watkins offered to hang on this cross for a week. And this was to show that Manson had incredible power over this lad. And also, basically, this was apparently one of the ways utilizing LSD that he got his followers to have this cult-like adherence, because they felt that he was Jesus as he was hanging off this cross. The only problem is this cross was removed in 1958, so it never happened. So this was a complete fabrication that was tied into the legend of Krishna Venter, and the entire legend of Krishna Venter was appropriated straight to Charles Manson. None of what was said about this cult, the Helter Skelter race war, came from Charles Manson. It all came from Paul Watkins. And what's strange is it's word for word taken from, in the prosecution's case, taken from this book called The Life of Krishna Venter. And so that is essentially where they got that. Why? Why did they have to come up with this crazy thing? Why did they get the Beatles involved?
Well, that's what I was going to ask, is that we have all this stuff kind of swirling around, and I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, well, what were they trying to do? What was Charles Manson, and what were they trying to do with Manson, and what was going to be his role?
Well, Manson was just unfortunate, really. He was on the periphery of the whole thing, but he really wasn't involved. What happened was that Vincent Bugliosi had to create this concept. He had to create a motive. As I say, for a long time, they didn't want to solve this case. For whatever reason, the LAPD turned up. They told lots of lies to the press about what was found at the place, at the scene, and they just seemed to not want to solve either of these cases. Very, very bizarre. So the suggestion is that Vincent Bugliosi, who, now this is going to be a running theme as well, has connections to what shall we call well-dressed Italian gentlemen. He, along with Paul Caruso, who was also a prosecuting attorney, who also had connections to well-dressed Italian gentlemen, and Richard Calabrero, who these were the high-priced lawyers that basically turned up on the door of Susan Atkinson at Susan Atkins' cell and said, "We'll represent you for free if you give us the rights to the story." This was before, obviously, a Helter Skelter or anything had been suggested. Their usual clientele were well-dressed Italian businessmen. One of their clients was a chap called Joel Rostow, who was a noted cocaine dealer for Genovese. And the suggestion is that Joel Rostow delivered a large supply of drugs to Cielo Drive on the night of the murders. And this has been put forward by people like Nicholas Schreck, William Scanlon Murphy, and it's also come out through various different witness statements, including Jay Sebring's girlfriend confirmed that this was the case. Van Dyke Parks, who was connected to the Beach Boys, confirmed that this was the case, and various members of the so-called family have also said that this is the case. So we can already see a sort of a strange influence. The suggestion is that with the Tate murders, what actually happened was there was a drug deal, and Tex, because he owed money essentially, or a favour to Charles Manson because of the Bobby Beausoleil situation and because of the Bernard Crowe situation, which we can talk about in a minute, he essentially went to Cielo Drive to try and rob the drugs. This was because him and Linda Kasabian a few days earlier had bought some of the MDA that was being sold out of Cielo Drive by Wojtek Frykowski. Wojtek Frykowski was a friend of Roman Polanski's, and he was basically leeching off Abigail Folger. Abigail Folger was an incredibly wealthy coffee heiress and friends with this whole crowd. Wojtek was essentially trying to get himself into the film industry, and this wasn't really working. So he and Jay Sebring decided to set up a sideline in selling drugs. Jay Sebring was already the premier cocaine salesman for the Hollywood crowd. His clientele included Marilyn Monroe, Peter Lawford, Sammy Davis Jr., Warren Beatty, Steve McQueen. Even it suggested the Camelot crowd, which would be, and the Rat Pack, obviously. He serviced them, although not Frank Sinatra. All he actually did for Frank Sinatra was cultivate his toupee. You see, Jay Sebring was the gentleman that popularized male grooming. He introduced shampoo and scissors, which, that sounds nuts, but this was not done. Men's hair was cut clippers and never shampooed. And he made it fashionable to be able to take care of yourself. And, he actually fashioned Jim Morrison's haircut, turning him into, this sexually oozing lizard king.
So, but Neil, when you talk about the Camelot crew, are you talking about Peter Lawford, people attached to Kennedy?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, apparently so. This is, this is the point. This is why it was too big of a, you can start to see hang on, why perhaps all of this would need to be covered up. Why the real motivation for this horrific crime would need to be, memory hold. Basically, as I say, Wojtek Pekowski was getting this batch of MDA, which is essentially like ecstasy, but a little bit different, from a series of Canadian drug dealers. And they were all actually questioned after the case. Now, some of them, bizarrely, knew Richard Calabero, who was the lawyer for Susan Atkins. And Paul Caruso as well, who was the other lawyer. So they were getting all this MDA in. One of them was named Billy Doyle. Billy Doyle was also the boyfriend of Mama Cass at times, because Mama Cass was an incredible strung-out junkie that basically would take anything. She was involved in some of the sexual videos that were seized at Cielo Drive, including one where it's her and Yul Brynner and Warren Beatty. And she also had Susan Atkins stay with her for a time when Susan Atkins was kicked out of Spahn Ranch, which she was often, and when she fancied a bacon sandwich rather than the strict vegetarian diet, she went over to Mama Cass's house because these guys were all friends basically.
Yeah.
So Wojtek Pekowski decides to get this MDA in, and he sells a couple of $1,000s worth of it to Tex and Linda Kasabian. Linda Kasabian had joined the so-called family not long before, literally about a couple of days after meeting Tex, stealing a load of LSD and thousands of dollars off her ex-husband's new lover, essentially, and giving it to Tex. It was never given to Charles Manson. It was given to Tex. Tex was the person that basically manipulated Linda Kasabian. This was not what was said at the trial. Everyone said that, it was Manson, Manson, Manson. They felt aggrieved that they were ripped off by Wojtek Pekowski because he gave them a bad batch of this MDA. To be fair, Wojtek did find out that his batch was particularly bad, and he invited the dealer over to Mama Cass's house on about August the 4th. The dealer was named Billy Doyle. Billy Doyle didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't even know that his batch of MDA was particularly bad. But what happened when he turned up was that Wojtek Pekowski chained him to a tree, beat him, and raped him.
Oh, boy.
So this is the type of crowd that they're dealing with, and we know this to be true because Michelle Phillips, former wife of John Phillips and Mamas and the Papas, and Dennis Hopper were there to see this, and they recounted this on occasions to various journalists. Apparently, according to Bobby Beausoleil, this was not uncommon. The Cielo Drive crowd had a bit of a penchant for picking up homeless runaways, taking them up, and basically performing sadomasochistic acts on them, which they would then film. So these were not necessarily the nice people that their public image might portray.
So it sounds like the picture that you're painting here is that we have this very intricate and very involved group of high-powered people, a lot of high-powered people that are involved, heavily involved in sex, sexual decadence, sexual deviance, and drugs.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And this is exactly why such a drama could not come out. This explains perfectly why the police avoided the obvious lines of evidence right at the beginning. And then when the actual case did come to court, it was a fairly open and shut case. Why did they need to concoct this incredible story around that doesn't really make any sense? I mean, one part of the helter-skelter thing that doesn't make sense is if they genuinely believed that they were starting a race war by committing these murders, 2 points. One, why did they stop? Because the race war had not started. So that sort of self-defeats that particular motive. Second point, they hadn't actually found their base in the desert yet. So if this race war was to start, they would have been, out of luck. They would have been they wouldn't have been in the safe place that they were supposedly going to find. The other point is that basically Manson had a series of very successful drug dealing and car shopping enterprises, also making pornography. At various residences that the group stayed, it shows that basically they were selling drugs and they were filming pornography. The other point is that a lot of people don't seem to pick up on, that again alleviates a lot of the mystery around the sort of the reason that the girls were so subservient to Manson, seemingly, and there were their sexual sort of liberation, etc., etc., etc. Manson was a pimp. Manson was a pimp in the 50s. Manson had a pimping agency called 3 Star Enterprises in Hollywood that he ran with a bloke called Tony Cassini that was a mafia guy. Right? Whilst Manson was in prison, he rubbed shoulders with Frank Costello, right? The godfather, the prime minister of crime, okay, and was his lackey essentially for a long time. He also knew Frankie Carbo later when he was in a different prison. And he also rubbed shoulders with Alvin Creepy Karpis. Now, Alvin Creepy Karpis is usually sort of cast aside as a bit of a side note. He taught him the guitar. He was used to be in Alcatraz, blah, 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 blah. Creepy Karpis wrote a letter to Frankie Carbo and Mickey Cohen. It was Creepy Karpis that got Manson an introduction to singing the mafia-run clubs in San Francisco, because essentially the mafia were in control of the entertainment industry. Just before Manson was released in 1967, he was visited by a lawyer called George Shibley. George Shibley charged $250 an hour and was from, I think it was Wilshire Boulevard. Like, it was, again, it was a Beverly Hills lawyer. Why is he visiting Manson?
Yep.
The other thing about Manson that's fascinating is that basically, whilst he was out, he committed at least 6 felonies. 6 felonies. Never had a permanent place of residence. Never had a job. Constantly moved around. Didn't sign in with his parole officer, Roger Smith. And depending on which way you're talking to, Roger Smith will either say that he always knew that Manson was a wrong-un, or he never saw any signs that Manson was unusual, dependent on who he speaks to. But for some reason, Manson was able to evade going back to prison. Like, he was on parole, and he got caught with drugs, driving without a license, giving a false ID, statutory rape, suspicion of car theft, caught with weapons on him.
And this is when he was on parole?
Yeah, this is all in 1967, 1968, 1969.
Wow.
So, again, there's something very strange going on. Manson appears to have some sort of secret handshake or note from teacher or whatever that basically allows him to transgress these situations. This is another point, right, Kate? But again, if we think of Manson as a pimp, it sort of demystifies the relationship that he has with these girls. If we think of him as essentially a rather charismatic ex-con that's managed to track down all these girls, they've all been kicked out by their parents, they've all got father issues, and what does he do immediately when he meets them? He sleeps with them, and he tells them, imagine I'm your dad. Yeah. You know who else does that? Pimps.
Pimps, yeah.
Absolutely. And if we think of Manson as a drug-dealing pimp, it suddenly becomes a lot clearer. And essentially, what are they doing? Again, if you actually track the movement chronologically, they're in San Francisco, they go down to Mexico, they go up to Seattle, they go back down to Texas, they go back up to Seattle, they go back down to Alabama, they go across to San Francisco, LA, up, down, up, down, up, down. Well, what do you think they're doing? They're getting drugs from Mexico or near to Mexico. They're coming back to the West Coast, and they're going up and down the West Coast selling drugs and pimping girls. And suddenly there you go, oh, well, that's where they're getting all the money from then.
Drugs and prostitution, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we know that he was a drug dealer because one of his clients was Dean Martin. Dean Martin used to buy his cocaine from Manson when he wasn't buying it from Jay Sebring, because apparently Manson's was better. We also know that he was a pimp because several of the girls have actually said that he had his front porch and his back porch girls. Essentially, like, the girls that he thought were particularly pretty, like Brenda and Sandra and stuff like that, and the girls that were less so.
The A grade, the B grade.
Yeah, absolutely. And he also had a bottom bitch, which was Squeaky, who basically took over the running of the Spa Ranch for him, or essentially, got it. Here's another thing, right? Okay, a lot of people will go that basically, wow, well, we know that he was sort of controlling these girls because he changed their names. He didn't change their names. All the nicknames, Tex, Squeaky, Cappy, they all came from George Spahn. George Spahn gave these people Wish. Snake named herself Susan Atkins. To be fair, Susan Atkins was given the name Sadie Mae Glutz by Charles Manson. But this was only because basically, at this point, they were all rolling around with false IDs. Because they were all on either parole or wanted on various warrants and stuff like that. So if you're rolling around with a fake ID, it makes it easier for you to evade capture. Not so mysterious after all. It actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're skipping ahead slightly, but why do you think they had dune buggies whilst they were living in the desert? So they could go to Mexico, get drugs across the desert, and if they were chased, they could go places that the police couldn't go.
Okay, so Charlie was involved in organized crime.
Yes. No, he wasn't like a member, although he basically talks obliquely about it. He says, no, Frankie Carbo, he wanted to. He says, I've been in the mafia since I was 16. He's not in the mafia. He basically, has a loose affiliation to some mafia types.
It sounded like he was running the street activities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, before he went to prison in the 50s, what did he get caught doing? Running cars down to Florida and pimping girls in Texas. Now, you can't do those two things without the tacit approval of organized crime because, they don't tend to like people muscling in. Also, when he went to Mexico in the late 50s, he's basically talked on many occasions obliquely that he was moving cocaine for the mafia. So, again, interesting that he's on the periphery of all of these criminal activities.
It makes perfect sense now. It's really starting to come together. The story that we were told, like I mentioned before we started the show, it just seems to be this big mishmash of nonsense. And now you're painting this picture where, okay, this is why you were given a big mishmash of nonsense. It's because Charles Manson was involved with some very high-powered people.
Yep.
They were running, like I mentioned before, there was pornography and there was drugs, and he's chopping up cars and so on. And so there were a lot of people involved that didn't want anybody to know that they were involved.
Yeah. Now, why was Cielo Drive chosen? And why, what was the catalyst?
Yeah, and this is Roman Polanski's place, right?
Yeah. This is where Roman Polanski was living, and Terry Melcher used to live there. Now, here's something that doesn't get talked about. When Terry Melcher moved out, before Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate moved in, you'll never guess who lived there or lived in the guest house.
Who?
Tex.
Okay. All right.
Tex and Dean Morehouse. They were friends. They were friends with Rudy Altobelli. Rudy Altobelli is the owner of Cielo Drive. Rudy Altobelli also claimed to be in the mafia. Also, Rudy Altobelli charged Roman Polanski because he ruined his carpet. Now, here's an interesting thing. On the day after the murders, guess who turned up at the house? Possibly, although this has not been confirmed, before the police. Rudy Altobelli, film producer Robert Evans, and Jack Nicholson.
They got there before the police.
Well, they certainly got there on the morning after the murders. Whether they got there before or after the police has never been made clear. They were there to clear up the place so that Roman didn't have a shock when he got home. Now, what's strange is they didn't clear up the place. They left the bloodstains on the carpet and on the door where pig was written in Sharon Tate's blood. And then, when Roman Polanski got back, Rudy Altobelli sued him for ruining his property value.
What are friends for, Neil?
Robert Evans put Roman Polanski up in a suite that had recently been vacated by Julie Andrews at Paramount Studios.
Oh, my God.
But charged him for it. Now, here's the strange thing, right? Robert Evans was supposed to go around that night and check on Sharon. He'd been doing it every single day. Every single day that Roman wasn't there, he went round and checked on her. That particular day, for whatever reason, he didn't. He phoned her. And she said, "No need to come over. I'm going over to my friend Sheila Wells's house." And then she got a headache and decided not to go to Sheila Wells's house. Now that's strange for two reasons, right? One, because at the trial, Sandra Good kept trying to approach Doris Tate and say, "We're so sorry. We thought Sharon was not there. We were told Sharon was not there. We phoned ahead to check." Now, the second interesting connection to Robert Evans is that if you know about the Cotton Club murder, essentially Robert Evans and Laney Jacobs and a chap called Roy Radin were trying to finance a film called The Cotton Club. And to do this, they got into buying and selling some cocaine. Laney Jacobs just so happened to be a frequent house guest and friend of Dennis Wilson. And so interacted with Manson once we were staying at Dennis's house. What happened was essentially Roy Radian ran off with the money and the drugs, and so Laney Jacobs got a hitman called Bill Menser. Bill Menser is connected to the Son of Sam killings and the murder of a lady called Alice Perry, and it is very likely that he was one of the shooters in the Son of Sam killings. And he essentially murdered Roy Radian by shooting his head off with a shotgun and then putting a stick of dynamite in the hole and blowing the rest of him up. And then he decorated the murder site with satanic trinkets. And he was genuinely described by the police as part of a satanic hit group. So he, in that sense, that is essentially true. This chap Bill Menser was lunatic. Anyway, on the stand, he claimed that he was ordered to kill Roy Radin directly by Robert Evans. Robert Evans was later convicted for connection to cocaine. Robert Evans got his break in the business because of his lawyer friend, Sidney Korshak. Sidney Korshak was in the mafia. Sidney Korshak is the person that basically got Al Pacino in the Godfather film. Al Pacino was signed up to be in a film called The Film That Couldn't Shoot Straight, and there was no way he was getting out of this contract. So Sidney Korshak made one quick phone call, and Al Pacino's in the Godfather. And it's very, very similar to the Frank Sinatra story of him basically being tied to a contract with Tommy Dorsey, and somebody turning up and basically making an offer. I believe it was Johnny Rosselli, but I might be wrong about that. Turning up and basically, putting a gun to his head. And no, in fact, it was Sam Giancana, sorry. And basically, therefore, Frank Sinatra is no longer in that contract. And then, bizarrely, that was in The Godfather, because the Johnny Fontaine character is based on Frank Sinatra. And so the horse in the head, offer you can't refuse, is based on a real event. And bizarrely, there was an event like that to get Al Pacino in The Godfather. So, it goes round and round and round and round.
Unbelievable. So it has this whole foundation that's cemented into the mob. Now, Neil, I wanted to go back for a second. If I'm jumping ahead, just tell me that you'll get to this. Going back to Polanski's place and the murder of Sharon Tate, was that retribution for a bad drug deal? What was going on there then? Why did they go in to kill them?
Well, I'll explain. I think the easiest way is to basically just go back to explain how it started, which is basically Dennis Wilson. Now, Dennis Wilson is obviously, the drummer from the Beach Boys. And the story is that essentially he picked up Susan and Ella hitchhiking and took them back to his house, and they very soon sort of moseyed in and took over and blah, 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 blah. It's not true. Do you know, right? Charles Manson first met Dennis Wilson at Gary Hinman's house. Gary Hinman was the music teacher that was later killed by Bobby Beausoleil. He met him there because they were buying mescaline. They were both buying drugs from this guy. He later met again at Elvis Presley's house. Now, that sounds absolutely ludicrous, but we know this to be true because Michael Caine says it's so. In his autobiography, he recounts a party at Elvis Presley's house. Elvis wasn't there. Mama Cass introduced him to Charles Manson. Other people have confirmed that Charles Manson was a frequent guest at Elvis Presley's house.
This would be Michael Caine, the actor?
Yeah, who was also a client of Jay Sebring. And basically what was going off at Elvis's house was they were playing card games. And Manson apparently won a card game against Dennis Wilson, got him for a lot of money, and Dennis, who just split up with his wife, said, rather than me pay you the money, why don't you move in with me? Bring all your drugs and your girls. Come and knock about with my friends Terry Melcher and Greg Jacobson, and Sharat Khatami and Rudy Altabelli. Sharat Khatami was the Iranian photographer that apparently was friends with Sharon Tate, and bizarrely, he was a hash dealer. So again, we're tending to see these running themes. So the Manson clan moved over to Dennis Wilson's house. Now, the person that was already living there was Tex. Why? Because Tex was a drug dealer, and Dennis liked drugs. And so they basically got into a lot of drugs and a lot of sex. Now, one of the things, again, this is one of the things that basically people didn't really want to get out. And it is, to my mind, that this is why the connection to the Beatles was formed. Dennis Wilson was involved in the Manson family orgies. The Manson family orgies were bisexual. Dennis Wilson and Charles Manson were very possibly lovers. Now, this has also been supported by several statements from Charles Manson and from Dennis himself, and also from various sort of people around the group of varying degrees of X-rated nature.
Yeah, so they're gay lovers.
Yeah, well, very possibly. I mean, they were certainly involved. They were certainly friends, and they were certainly involved in bisexual orgies, because that was the order of the day with the Manson family. We're taking acid, and we're just having a free for all, essentially. So this is what's happening. But it also has been suggested that basically they were actually lovers and they were really, really close friends. Dennis Wilson basically arranged, or was trying to arrange, to get his record company, Brother Records, to put out an album by Manson. And this was going to be produced by Terry Melcher, overseen by Greg Jacobson, Stephen Desper, and Mike Deasy. And this was first discussed in the summer of 1968, which is 1 year before the official records say that Melcher and Manson met. We also know from Dina Martin's biography that Manson was at parties at Cielo Drive in 1968. But again, this all gets completely memory hold. Manson knew Melcher had moved out because Tex moved in. He'd also been and visited Terry Melcher at Malibu before and after the murders. So he knew that Terry Melcher was not there. So again, that was just a lie. So anyway, him and Bobby Beausoleil, who's this other guy that's basically been knocking around with Kenneth Anger and who's a sort of Luciferian follower of Aleister Crowley.
Right.
He sort of knocks along with them, and they meet at the Spiral Staircase and at Spahn Ranch and various other places. And basically he's a musician as well. He is involved in Frank Zappa. He plays on the Mothers of Invention album, and he was also supposedly to do the soundtrack for a Kenneth Anger film, and also appears in a couple of them with Anton LaVey in one scene actually. So they're going to get an album together, and there was a bit of a bidding war going on apparently. Neil Young got Mo Austin from Universal Records. He was going to offer Manson a record contract. But essentially, they said, we've already got it tied up. It's going to be a record and a documentary. And the musical group is going to be called, you ready for this? The Manson Family Jams. The Manson family was not a cult. It was a musical group. The cult aspect of it was this criminal and his pimping activities. Right, okay? But the Manson family was essentially the name of the group. They were actually called the Family Jams. And this, again, has been confirmed by Dennis Wilson when we were talking to Rave magazine in England. He says, yeah, we're going to put out the Family Jams. And, they're great. He actually calls Manson the Wizard in that article. And that article talks about how he's taught him that, yeah, you don't need possessions. You don't need this. At times, Dennis Wilson was going to go and live in the desert with the Manson family because, you know, they rejected modern society. They much preferred to live on a ranch and do drugs, to be quite honest, and have sex, which, you know, I'm sure has got his ups. But what happened was eventually Nick Grillo, who was the manager of the Beach Boys, who was basically also connected to the mafia, he got sick of Manson doing this, and they threatened to chuck Dennis into a psychiatric ward. And so they basically went and kidnapped Dennis and took him away. To be quite honest, there was only 3 weeks left on his lease of this house anyway, so it was not as a dramatic kicking out as some have made out, but it was Nick Grillo. Now, in this time, Manson had written at least 3 songs for the Beach Boys, which appeared on the 2020 album, but were credited to Dennis. One of them, the most famous, is Never Learn Not to Love, which was originally called Cease to Exist. So again, this goes some way towards showing that people were serious about him and his musical ability. He recorded at Brian Wilson's house. They recorded albums worth, according to Nick Grillo, over 300 hours worth of material at Brian Wilson's private bedroom studio. The only other person that ever recorded there was Brian Wilson.
Yep.
That's incredible. That does not happen. Like, and they were all over the place. There were lots of different studios. A lot of it was basically destroyed.
Well, that also ties into to what you said before, the possibility that they had a relationship.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's not actually me that believes that. That is a theory that is prominently out there. Yeah. So anyway, they're kicked out and they move over to the Spahn Ranch. Now, Tex has been coming and going because basically he's not really part of the group, despite the fact that he was later portrayed as being Manson's right-hand man. Now, what happens is he leaves the ranch and starts being a drug dealer with this prostitute called Rosina. And she basically rips him off for some money. It's not entirely clear what happened, but I think basically she pretended to be pregnant, took some money for an abortion, and just ran off with the money. So what he decides to do is he's going to get his girlfriend back. So he goes over to her house and arranges this deal with this black dealer called Bernard Lotzapopper Crow, who's well known to the Manson clan, by the way. Like they all know each other. Like, this is not an unknown person. And Tex basically says, I've got 15 odd grand's worth of, I think it was that much, of grass. Give me the money, I'll go and get it for you, and I'll leave my girlfriend here as collateral. Now they don't know that basically he's fallen out with his girlfriend, so they say, yeah, fine. So Tex just goes out the back door and just gets in a car with a bloke called TJ Wallerman and just boom, just hightails it back to the ranch. And it takes about 30 minutes for Lotzapopper to figure out what's gone off. So he phones Spahn Ranch and he says, I want to speak to Charles. I'm going to burn the ranch down. Now everybody assumes that he means Charles Manson because, you know, Charles said he doesn't. It means Charles Denton Watson, Tex. But Tex refuses to answer the phone. Now, Lotzapopper basically says, I'm going to kill this girl, I'm going to rape her, I'm going to cut her head off, and then we're going to come down to the ranch mob-handed, we're going to rape all the women, we're going to kill all the blokes, and we're going to burn the house down unless you come back with my money. And so Manson goes, right, well, we're going to have to sort this out. Tex refuses, and everyone else refuses, which begs the question, if he's a cult leader, what the hell's going on there? Why are his acolytes?
How do they refuse the cult leader?
Absolutely. So basically he goes off and goes to Lotzapopper's house, or Rosina's flat, sorry. Lotzapopper's not there, and he basically unties the girl and starts, you know, trying to calm everything down. Lotzapopper gets back and says, what the hell's going on here? Who's untied this woman? And starts to choke Manson. Manson whips out a gun and points it at him. Oh, no, sorry. Manson whips out a gun and points it at him and says, yeah, you know, I'm going to shoot you. And the gun goes off, but doesn't fire. Whether it was by accident or what, nobody quite knows. But basically the gun goes off. And Lotzapopper tries to choke Manson. The gun goes off again and shoots him in the stomach. And he falls to the ground and they assume that he's dead. So they take Rosina, they leave, and they go away. Now, unfortunately, one of the people that was there, well, Bernard Crowe turned out to be fine. He was absolutely fine. He did very painful, obviously, but he didn't die. One of Bernard Crowe's mates was friends with Greg Jacobson. And Greg Jacobson is obviously connected to the Beach Boys. These are the Golden Penetrators with Dennis Wilson. This got back to them, and they're like, oh, well, this puts a bit of a dampener on the album. Because at this point, they thought that he'd killed Bernard Crowe. There was a bit of a mixed message going off. And even when they found out that he didn't, they were like, okay, well, he's going to prison for this, isn't it? Okay, right. So we need to sort of like scrub this. So basically, Terry Melcher at this point started to back off on the album a bit. He did actually go to the ranch many times after that, and with the possibility that this might continue. So it wasn't as cut off as All Be, but basically they all of a sudden started dialing back on the album.
So Charlie shoots this guy, and they're concerned that it might put a dent into the release of the album.
Yeah, absolutely. So they back off with it at that point, basically. At which point Manson gets a bit pissed with Nick Grillo and Dennis Wilson and starts demanding money for the songs that he's written. Now, at this point, there's a really telling exchange between Nick Grillo, who's the Beach Boys manager, and Charles Manson. Basically, Charles Manson goes, I want what's given to me, and, I'm not going to sue you. I'm going to come and burn your house down. And Nick Grillo says to Charlie, you do that, I'll phone New York. New York is the mafia. He's going to phone the East Coast mafia. Manson retorts, you're not phoning New York, I'll phone New York. I ice pick for New York. Right? So basically, what's happening is they're basically both threatening each other to get the mafia on one another if they don't get what they want out of this particular deal. Again, it just sort of goes to show this particular theme that seems to be skirting around on the edges of it. In the meantime, there's this chap called Danny DiCarlo, who's a straight Satan motorcyclist. Manson's basically becoming affiliated with a lot of these biker gangs for two reasons. One, because they move speed, and another reason because they're customers for his girls. So, there's the drug avenue for sales, and there's also the sales avenue for his girls. They'll tell you that basically this was because he was terrified of the Black Panthers and so wanted to get an army together for Helter Skelter. But again, this just simply isn't true. That you can see that this isn't true by the actions of the straight Satans, who were never really publicly affiliated to Manson in that sense, or certainly didn't want to be. They weren't his acolytes by any stretch of the imagination, although Manson has claimed to be a straight Satan on several occasions. Now, Danny DiCarlo, who basically turned up at the ranch, he went by the charming nickname Donkey Dick Dan. For some reason, he was dead popular with the girls. I don't know why. But basically, he turned up at the ranch and brought a load of guns. He was the person that brought guns to the ranch, including machine guns. Now, what's bizarre about this is that the police knew that they had machine guns at the ranch, and again, for some reason, didn't bother to do anything about it. It's almost as if basically they were giving Manson a bit of a free rein. Anyway, so he turns up with the guns and soon takes up with Susan Atkins, and she becomes his main squeeze. Essentially, they're having a party there, and the rest of his gang turn up and threaten to kill Bobby Bosley. Bobby Bosley's tried to get in with them by selling them $1,000 worth of mescaline, which he got from Gary Hinman. It turns out to be bad, apparently, and they say, get us the money or the drugs, otherwise we'll kill you. So, now this is where it gets all a bit strange. Essentially, it was Danny DiCarlo that forced Bobby Bosley. Danny DiCarlo, you remember, was one of the material witnesses for the prosecution. He forced Danny DiCarlo to go. He gave him a gun and instructed him to get the money back at all costs. Bobby goes over there with Susan Atkins and Mary Bruner, which proves that essentially he didn't go over there to kill him. He didn't go over there. He just went over there to talk because they were all friends. You don't take Mary Bruner to be your assassin. It just doesn't work like that. They turned up and basically everything was quite, cordial. They were chatting. They were even showing, you say, I ain't got the money, Bobby. I'm really sorry. I ain't got it. Can you get me the drugs back? I can see what's wrong with it. No. Well, dude, I'm in a bit of a pickle. I can't really do anything for you. I really can't. There's nothing I can do. Now, at this point, Bobby starts to panic because Danny DiCarlo's threatened to kill him. So he whips out a gun and basically threatens the gun that Danny gave him and threatens, I'm going to shoot this gun off. They get into a bit of a wrestling match and the gun goes off and shoots into a sink. And this basically sobers everybody up, and they basically sit down and start to figure out what they can do. And they arrange that Gary Hinman will give him his 2 cars, and he'll sell them, and then basically that money will cover it. And then they can sort this all out later because, he's off to Japan in a couple of days, so he really doesn't care about this. Unbeknownst to them, as the gunfight's going off, Mary Bruner's panicked, and she's phoned Manson. Manson turns up with Bruce Davis, who's a friend of him, and immediately gets the wrong end of the stick and just kicks open the door pretty much and smacks Gary across the face with a sword, cutting him across the ear and the cheek, and then just leaves. Says and he thinks that he's turned up and been the hero. Like, he's just been a very stupid person, basically. So he leaves. And Bobby phones him back at the ranch. He says, "What the bloody hell have you done, you idiot? Like, it was all sorted. It was totally fine." Now, at this point, basically, Gary starts getting all narky, saying, "Well, I'm going to the police. I'm sick of this. You've cut my face. I'm going to the police. I don't care what this is about. I'm going to the police." And Bobby panics because all of a sudden everything's going off. And so he stabs him. He stabs him a couple of times. The girls are horrified because they don't know what's going off. They basically make a really half-assed attempt to blame it on the Black Panthers because Gary Hinman was affiliated with far leftist groups. And so they thought, well, if we can set it up so it looks kind of like there was an internal row, then fair enough, maybe this will look kind of, it'll lead people off the scent. And so they write "Political Piggy" on the wall in his blood. They then leave. Actually, basically, he's not quite dead, so Bobby smothers him with a pillow, and then they leave. Now, a lot of people say that they were gleefully reenacting this. They weren't at all. Bobby Bosley just basically wandered around in a complete daze for the next few days until he was picked up. He didn't even bother to change out the clothes that he was wearing. He was picked up in Gary Hinman's car with the bloody knife on him, covered in blood, 3 days later. He was a kid. He was 17, 18 years old. He'd done something completely stupid. Another guy from a fractured background of abuse and broken homes and homelessness and, probably, essentially being a rent boy for a short time when he was younger and stuff like this. So, these are all very, very damaged people.
And this whole thing, Neil, was because of $1,000 worth of drugs.
Pretty much.
Holy smokes.
Yeah. So, because of this, and the Bernard, basically Bobby gets sent to prison. Now, at this point, it's all very, very strange because on August the 8th, which is the night of the tape murder, there's a suggestion that Manson wasn't even there, that he was actually in San Diego, and he phoned through and basically was told Bobby's in prison. Now, what his instructions were is not entirely clear, but he basically said, look, I owed Bobby a favour because I'd messed up with Gary Hinman. Tex, you owe me a favour because you messed up with lots of Popper. You do the favour for Bobby. It's nothing to do with me anymore. So basically Manson sort of says, I'm not involved in this. I owe Bobby a favour. Tex owes me a favour. Tex, you owe Bobby a favour. It's nothing to do with me. I'm washing my hands of it. Also, he's off at this point with a 17-year-old girl called Stephanie Schramm. Now, this is interesting because a lot of people obviously say that Manson's a Nazi. He believes in white separatism, in a race war. He was anti-Black Panther. He's got a swastika on his face. These types of things. Stephanie Schramm was Jewish. Stephanie Schramm, he was going to leave the group at Spahn Ranch to run off with Stephanie Schramm. He fancied her that much. She's Jewish. That sort of goes against this concept that he hated black people and that he killed Shorty Shea because his wife was black. When he was in prison, do you know one of his good friends? Geronimo Pratt, Black Panther. This has been confirmed in several books, including Geronimo Pratt's autobiography. Now, it would be stupid and naive to suggest that Manson wasn't a white separatist and had certain values that are anathema to our values today. But so did an awful lot of people at that time, to be quite honest. This is why I think that the helter-skelter thing was so successful. It's because essentially in 1967, there were over 1,000, I think there were nearly 2,000 race riots in America that year. It's called the Long Hot Summer. There was, you know, the murder of various Black Panthers, the murder of Martin Luther King, the murder of Malcolm X. It was a very tumultuous time. The concept of a race war, as silly and sort of like ludicrous as it sounds now, at the time was a conceivable motive for a crazy person. So the concept of helter-skelter was perhaps more plausible than now. Also, the swastika on his face, he got it from an Indian, an American, Native American, that he met in prison called Walks on Top. And he said, Walks on Top said, this is a sun symbol. It's to protect me from white people. So, and Manson has confirmed this. He says, this isn't the Nazi party. This is my party. This is a sun symbol. This is to protect me from white people. So, you know, again, it would be stupid to suggest that he was an advocate for, complete equality. But again, this concept that he was a Nazi is actually not quite as accurate as anyone would make out.
Well, and the Nazi symbol is an ancient sun symbol.
That's what it was. I mean, originally it was backwards as well. Right. He did join the Aryan Brotherhood in prison, but at this point, it's because basically the entire world knew that he was a Nazi, and so if he didn't, he was going to get, you know, probably shanked up. He actually left the Aryan Brotherhood pretty damn quick because he refused to kill a black person. And so they kicked him out of the Aryan Brotherhood because they found that he wasn't racist enough for them. And then this actually started a back and forth between the Aryan Brotherhood. Bizarrely, a lot of Manson's followers ran off with Aryan Brotherhood members and became Nazis afterwards. I mean, the other thing is that actually, you know, Gypsy was Jewish. She was a member of the so-called family one. Flynn was Panamanian. There were various, you know, different races and ethnic backgrounds, and it didn't really seem to be that much of an issue. Like, I mean, the thing is, it was a very racist time, to be quite honest, in comparison to nowadays. But again, I think that the construction of the helter-skelter myth was predicated on that. So essentially, what happens is that Tex and Linda decide to go to Cielo Drive. Not because it's Terry Melcher's house, but because they're familiar with the layout and that they know a drug deal is going to go down there. So they turn up. Now, the official story says that basically they turned up, cut the phone wire, and hopped over the fence. And this lad, Stephen Parent, who was visiting William Garrettson, who was the gardener, was coming down the drive. And Tex ran up to him and said, "Stop, halt," put his hand out, shot him, then took his knife out, stabbed him in the hand, and then shot him to death. And he was apparently the first person killed at Cielo Drive. Now, what's wrong with that story? Well, for a start, it's totally impractical. How many hands has he got? Has he got 3 hands? How is he holding his hand up, shooting him, pulling out a knife, opening the car door? How's he doing all these things at the same time? Yeah. Okay. Also, we know that their phone line wasn't cut because during the time when the actual murders were supposed to be going on, a phone call was made from Cielo Drive to Witold Quay, who's a friend of Wojtek Krakowski. So we know that to be a lie. The other point is that if you examine Stephen Parent's car, there's scratches all down the side of it as if he's reversed down the hill at speed and hit the fence. Well, why is this? Well, here's another interesting thing. In the initial police report, the fabled slit screen, where they slit the screen so that they could go in and then open the front door, that was never in the original police report. The original police report had them either being let in or walking in through the front door. Also, there were 2 open windows next to the screen that was presented. It was found later and presented. There were 2 open windows next to it, which would have meant that they could have climbed in the windows. No need to cut the screen. So the suggestion is that essentially they arrived and thought there was going to be a cordial drug deal, but actually Tex is there to take all the money. Now, here's the other thing. if they were actually going to kill everybody there, which is the story, go to Cielo Drive, paint a picture more gruesome than the world has ever seen. This will spur on the race war and really get at the establishment piggies and stuff like that as a revenge. They took one gun and 2 knives or 3 knives maybe. It's not a lot, is it? If you plan to kill, do you know what I mean? It's just about enough if you're going to do a strong arm robbery. Or if a poorly conceived robbery. So essentially what the suggestion is, looking by the police report and the murder scene and looking at the forensic evidence, the first person to be stabbed or potentially die, but probably not die, just be stabbed, was Sharon Tate. She wasn't the last to die. A lot of her blood is found on the porch, and then there's a big splash of Jay Sebring's blood on the porch, and then over the hedge just in front of the porch. Now, at about 12:15, the neighbours reported hearing a man's voice shouting, "Oh God, no, don't, please stop it." That's Jay Sebring reacting to Sharon Tate being stabbed. Shortly after that, we hear 2 gunshots. What are those gunshots for? Well, Stephen Parent has been coming out of William Garrettson's house, and he's seen this happening. He's got in his car, and in a panic, he's reversed down the hill to try and get away. Who was outside? Right? Linda Kasabian, the material witness. So it's very likely that it was actually Linda who stabbed Stephen Parent in the hand, and then Tex ran up to him and shot him to finish him off. We know that he died at 12:15 because that's what time his watch stopped, and that's what time the first set of 2 gunshots were reported. This is half an hour after the official story. So basically, he then went back inside and finished off Jay Sebring. And then this is a bit of a contentious point because basically it would appear that he left Wojtek Frykowski and Abigail Folger alive, and they were tied up at the place. Whether he'd beaten them, whether he'd stabbed them, we don't know. What we do know is that basically a very, very short time after that, we hear more noise at Cielo Drive, and then 20 minutes after this, they're found at the Weber's house. There's a story that essentially Tex was found washing himself in the hose of the Weber's house, and this couple saw them at 1:15 in the morning, and basically, what are you doing? Oh, we're on our way back, sorry, and they just sort of disappeared.
So the Weber's house is a neighbor?
Yeah, well, the Weber's house backs onto Jay Sebring's house.
Okay.
That's never talked about. So what happened was, by looking at the timeline, they left in an incredible hurry from Cielo Drive, so it's completely plausible that they mistakenly left Wojtek and Abigail still alive, and within about 10 minutes were like streets and streets and streets away outside Jay Sebring's house. Now, if you were going to rob Jay Sebring's house, remembering that Jay Sebring is a drug dealer, it's conceivable that you'd park on the next road and you'd go round the back. What happened was, as they were going to go around the back, the Webbers came out and caught them. Now, what's interesting about Linda Kasabian being outside, she testified that she was outside. She also testified to everything that happened inside the house, including the famous statement of Tex, "I am the devil and I'm here to do the devil's business." Now, one thing that was never raised at the trial was, that's impossible. You can't be inside and outside at the same time. So you're lying. I mean, Linda was caught lying about dozens and dozens and dozens of things. Essentially, the story that she told didn't really make sense. Anyway, so they basically go back to the ranch, and by this time, Manson has actually arrived back from San Diego with Stephanie Schramm. It's about 3:30, 4 in the morning, and at which point it becomes very clear that everything is absolutely messed up. So Manson gets back in the car, and it's at this point that Linda drives them over. The prosecution made a big deal about Linda driving them. The only reason that Linda was there was because she was the only person that had a driver's license. Other than that, she's completely innocent. Now, this isn't true, because even in her statement, she says that Tex drove them there. That there was 2 trips to Cielo Drive. She drove on the second, which means that she was there because she had a vendetta against Wojtek, who'd ripped her off. Anyway, so they get there at about 4 a.m. How do we know they got there at 4 a.m? Because neighbours heard arguing coming from Cielo Drive, followed by screams of a woman and gunshots. Okay, which means, and this was reported to the police at 4 a.m, which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the official story is just nonsense.
So let me make sure I'm tracking along with you, Neil. So they went there, Tex went there, and he killed Sharon Tate.
Yep, and Jay Sebring and Stephen Perrin.
Okay, and so he left 2 people alive.
Yes.
Then he left.
Went to Jay Sebring's house to try and get the drugs. They were scared off by the Webbers. They went back to Spahn Ranch, met Charlie, explained what had happened. Charlie very, very quickly realizes this is gonna look bad. So he picks up a pair of glasses, which he's going to deposit at the place as false evidence, and they go back over to Cielo Drive, at which point Wojtek and Abigail are killed. And we know this because basically that's when the gunshots and the screams are. Now, what this actually means is that Manson is guilty of accessory to murder and conspiracy. So he is guilty, it's just it happened in a very different way, and he certainly did not order those killings. Now, the next day, they go to the LaBianca's house. Now, apparently this is supposed to be completely random. Now, this depends on who you believe, because what Nicholas Schreck claims, and this is supported by a couple of statements, but the evidence for this isn't terribly strong.
Is this Nicholas Schreck, the Satanist?
That's him. He's a Buddhist now, apparently, but yes, this is him. He's written a book called The Myth of the Outlaw Shaman, the Manson Files, which is very, very good. Although
he's a Buddhist now?
Apparently so, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, although I don't agree with a lot of his findings in that book, but it is actually incredibly good. He suggests that Rosemary LaBianca was wealthier than Abigail Folger. She took constant trips to Mexico, and she was involved in a complicated mail fraud operation with Joel Rostow, the drug dealer that delivered cocaine to Cielo Drive. That we know to be a fact. What Nicholas Schreck claims to know from inside anonymous sources is that she was an LSD dealer, and she was supposed to give Joel Rostow some LSD on the night. So essentially that's what started the argument, was that Tex expected there to be LSD as well as cocaine and MDA, and there was no LSD. That is the contention of Nicholas Schreck. Whether that is true or not, it would make sense to the point where it explains some sort of mysterious elements of Rosemary's life. But as I say, the evidence for it isn't cast iron by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's circumstantial at best. What is strange, though, is that Tex was friends with Susan Struthers, who was Rosemary's daughter, estranged daughter. They didn't get on at all. They really, really didn't get on. And she went out with a chap called Joe Dorgan. Joe Dorgan was a straight Satan, and he was involved in Manson's car chopping operation and drug dealing. Basically, there'd been a whole series of burglaries that had been going on at the LaBianca's house. And the police were pretty convinced that it was Susan that was actually doing this. Now, whether Susan was doing this just to steal money, or whether this was part of a protracted insurance scam, is not known. What is known, though, is that Lino LaBianca owed $30,000 to Frankie Carbo. Now, Manson has stated in a Hardline interview that when he turned up there, he said to Lino, "Don't move or you're dead. Give me the black book, otherwise you're dead. I know Frankie Carbo. Okay? I'm here to get the black book for Frankie Carbo." And then he elaborates. He says, "Oh, did you know Lino?" And he says, "No, I didn't know Lino, but Lino knows Frankie, and I know Frankie Carbo." Now, that's certainly strange. Now, what's interesting as well is the Gateway shopping centre that Lino ran, that he was embezzling huge amounts of money from. to pay for the racehorses that his family didn't know he owned, along with all these massive gambling debts to various mafiosos, including Edward Pierce and Frankie Carbo. That was the shopping centre that the Manson clan used to go free diving in the bins for. They used to go bin dipping for food and such like that. Now, the only way that they could do this and not get sort of the police called on them was that they were, according to the words of the girls, was to sleep with the manager. Now, it's never been confirmed, but it would make sense that was Lino. So, basically, what happens is Tex and Manson turn up. Manson reportedly asks for this black book. Something to do with the music industry and the mafia. It's never ever been explained what this black book is. Now, sorry, I need to just wind back a bit. Basically, Manson and that are driving around. About 1:30 in the morning or whatever, they basically stop and make a mysterious phone call, and then just continue and at random turn up at the LaBiancas. Now, the LaBiancas have been away at the lake, Lake Isabella, with their son Frank, and they were supposed to come back earlier, but instead they decided to stay on a little bit later and tell Frank to stay on an extra day. When they get back to Los Angeles, they pick up a newspaper, and in the newspaper is the report of the Tate murders. Now, apparently, Rosemary LaBianca reacts with abject horror, as if she knows these people, but then when asked, she's like, oh, it's just a horrible case, which is very strange, basically, by the person who sold her the newspaper. They were friends, they saw each other every day, and he said this was very, very strange. The suggestion is perhaps she knew them on a professional level, which would support Nicholas Schreck's contention. Anyway, for some reason, the LaBiancas go back and basically sit up in their pajamas until about sort of 1:30, 2 in the morning, at which point Manson and Tex turn up. Now, what happens then is contested, but what is certainly true is that Rosemary was probably taken from the building. How do we know this? Because she had a dress put on over her nightdress. Also, the car with the boat attached to it, which was always put away on the drive behind the locked, in a safe place by Lino, was left out on the street with the boat still attached and the keys in the ignition and the door unlocked, which strongly suggests that somebody was taken from the building away somewhere and brought back. It has been said that the safe at the Gateway supermarket and at Rosemary LaBianca's boutique were empty the following morning. So the suggestion is that basically somebody's gone and taken something from the safe. Now, for whatever reason, people start getting – Tex murders them both. And there was torture done to Rosemary LaBianca. The police report suggests that she was either tortured in front of Lino or just basically tortured, which suggests a real sadistic hatred. Could this be because basically, she was ripping him off for LSD or lying to him about that, supporting Nicholas Schreck's contention? Could this just be because Tex is psychotic? Could this be because basically they were trying to do something for Susan? Susan inherited $2 million following the death of her mother, who she basically didn't like. Following the death, she turned up days after the murder, turned up with a truck, emptied anything of any value, and basically sold anything that she didn't want. So she wasn't particularly sentimental about.
She wasn't mourning.
No. What's strange is to say the suggestion is that perhaps they were going to plan a fake burglary for insurance purposes, because the following day, Lino was due to be, or the following Monday, Lino was due to be sacked from his position at the Gateway supermarket. So this would be the final opportunity that could actually get into the safe there. Now he's going to be sacked because his mother, who was on the board, who swore blind that he wasn't in the mafia, although other people say different, was going to sack him because he'd stolen like $200,000 from the supermarket to pay for his gambling debts. So the suggestion is that perhaps they set up this fake robbery. They were going to go in, tie them up. This is why the dogs didn't bark. This is why there was no resistance. This is why none of the numerous guns in the house were used. And Tex double-crossed them, either for his own ends or for Susan Struthers' ends. and stole whatever he could and made his way away. Now, the reason that it's suggested that perhaps Susan was involved in this setup is because many, many years later, under a false name, she did two things. She befriended the sister of Sharon Tate, never explained who she was, and enrolled her own child into the same school as Sharon Tate's Sharon Tate's niece. There's been all sorts of suggestions to why she was doing this. The Tates believed that she was trying to get so close to the child that she could kidnap her, so that basically this would cause the Tates to not turn up to Texas parole hearing. How they discovered this was her was because she turned up at Texas parole hearing and basically said that Tex is now a born-again Christian. She forgives Tex for the murder of her mother and stepfather, and believes that he should be freed. And she campaigned through the 700 Club, which was a television show, for Tex's release, which, strongly suggests that Susan Struthers was at least peripherally involved. She certainly benefited the most from this particular case. But yeah, I mean, that's the gist of it. There are other things as well. I mean, I think you're supposed to just address this now. A lot of people, the secondary sort of suggestion with all of these things is that basically the reason for the murders was to do with the Process Church of Final Judgment. Now, you may have heard of this. It's just this offshoot of Scientology run by Anne McLean and Robert de Grimston, and they basically felt that Satan and Jesus and God were archetypal representations of real gods, and that you had bits of these people in all of you, so you could be both Satan and Jesus at the same time. And a lot of this is manifest through the speeches of Charles Manson, through what he says, and through some reportings back. It's also true that they met the Process Church on numerous occasions at the Spiral Staircase and at Cole Street, and they were dealing with Brother Eli, who was a Process Church member, when in the dealing of drugs and pornography, essentially. Later, when Manson was in prison, apparently Process Church members visited him in a hope to get an interview for their magazine. And this didn't look very good because it made it look like they were connected to it. There's also an INS report from an anonymous source that suggests that Manson was connected to the Process Church, and that he was hired to kill Sharon Tate. And the reason they know this was because they were at a party with Sirhan Sirhan at Cielo Drive. Now, it's very, very unsubstantiated, that. Now, this is the theme that goes through, say, the Peter Lavander book.
1 second, Neil. So Sirhan was tied to... No,
it's nonsense. I don't buy that personally. That is one of the pieces of evidence that he was connected to the Process Church.
Because that was a new one. Okay.
It's an INS report, and basically it says that this unknown person who's connected to the Process Church had inside information that Manson killed Sharon Tate at the behest of the Process Church, and this was perhaps connected to Bill Mensa and the wider Son of Sam killings and such like that. And I have to say that initially I thought that to be the case, and I thought that to be very, very plausible, and I thought that the lines of evidence were very, very strong. And this is certainly the theory that is put forth in Shadow over Santa Susanna and the Peter Lavander books and The Family by Ed Sanders, and it's also sort of touched on a bit by Dave McGowan and such like that. And again, I thought this to be a very, very plausible suggestion, if a little thin. But there was certainly the process turn up here and here and here and here and here. So what I did was basically try to find out where this connection to the Process Church actually came from. Now, Ed Sanders, who was the main proliferator of this particular theory in his book The Family, he got it from Vincent Bugliosi, the DA. So he got it from the prosecution. Why would the prosecution give him information like that? Because essentially they didn't have enough evidence to get it into court, but they wanted this concept that Manson was connected to a, in inverted commas, cult, a satanic, in inverted commas, cult, so that the concept of him being a cult leader that ordered his acolytes to commit helter-skelter was more plausible in the eyes of the general public. So where did Vincent Bugliosi get this idea and we know this to be true because Ed Sanders admits this, by the way. He said that he got all this information from the prosecution who were giving it to him on the sly, and that he basically followed up these stories and he found these connections but could never quite pin it down. And the reason he can't quite pin it down is because it's not true. Where did Vincent Bugliosi get this story from? Vincent Bugliosi got it from the Church of Scientology. Now, when the Manson trial started, it became very apparent that Manson was into Scientology. They'd looked over his prison records and he'd signed himself as a Scientologist on several forms. He'd been given over 150 hours of auditing by a bloke called Lania Raymer, who claimed to have been trained by L. Ron Hubbard himself. This turned out to be a lie, but this was what was commonly thought. So Manson was seemingly very connected to the Church of Scientology. Bruce Davis and various other followers or supposed followers of Manson also had connections to the Church of Scientology. And Bruce Davis was actually working at the Church of Scientology headquarters in London at the time that the trial started. This was a huge public relations disaster for the Church of Scientology. All of a sudden, they're connected to the most sensational murder trial in the history of the current world. So what do? Well, they killed two birds with one stone. What they did was they were particularly annoyed with the Process Church of Final Judgment. They labelled these people as suppressive peoples because they'd left. They'd turned their backs on Elron and they'd gone off to form their own offshoot. So what they did was they went to the tabloids in England, the Mirror, and through UPI press releases and various other agencies, and put out stories saying that, oh, no, Manson's not connected to the Church of Scientology. He's connected to the Process Church. And, in case you didn't know, the Process Church is a satanic cult. So that's where that line of inquiry actually started. This was picked up by Vincent Bugliosi, feathered out a bit to make it a bit more sensational. This was passed on to Ed Sanders, who picked it up and very well-meaningly investigated what he thought to be a reasonable thread. Unfortunately, people that like Larry White Rabbit, who gave him information on this, and various other people, have been proven to be complete liars and to have got intimate details of the case that they were supposedly privy to wrong. A lot of the time they basically talk about Shorty Shea, who's a ranch hand, being decapitated, and this never happened. And they'll talk about other things that apparently happened that didn't actually happen, were actually just put out there in the public domain by these books, like including The Killing of Sharon Tate and Five to Die, and various other sort of tawdry pulp novels that were based on the supposed facts of the Manson killings that flooded the markets immediately. So this is the point. There's been an incredible sort of, as I say, there's been a cover-up. There's been a secondary line of inquiry to sort of lead people down a sort of conspiratorial route. And then there's the sort of the details behind it. And I'd be lying if I said that absolutely every single aspect of the case was sewn up. But that certainly makes a lot more sense and is a lot more logical and pragmatic than the concept of a race war and random killings and being angry at the music industry and various other contradictory motives that cancel each other out. And again, Manson has seemingly sort of confirmed a lot of this in talks with William Scala Murphy and in various other interviews. Like, for example, with Geraldo, at one point he just breaks down. He just says, like, do you know who the family actually are? You know, if you owe the family, you pay the family back. And Geraldo thinks that he's talking about the Manson family. He's not. He's talking about La Familia. He's talking about the Mafia. In an interview with Michael Ben Horen, or Michelle Ben Horen, he gets really cross. And he goes, basically, I'll tell you exactly what happened. I'm paraphrasing, but I'll tell you exactly what happened, but you won't get it. And he says something to the effect of, when the prostitute took the stand and basically lied and put Lucky Luciano in prison, that's what they did. And they played all of this and put another prostitute on the stand so that Rambo and Al Pacino and all these people could come through for Hollywood. And that sounds, on the face of it, like the ramblings of an insane person. But if you understand the story and you understand how to decode Manson's speech, what he's saying there is that basically, similarly to Lucky Luciano, who was a mafioso, who they couldn't actually get on a real crime, so John Dewey persuaded a prostitute to lie on the stand in order to actually get him sent to prison. Similar to that, you've got a prostitute to lie on the stand, Linda Kasabian, and basically perform some sort of ridiculous cover-up so that actors like Sylvester Stallone, Al Pacino, which is a metaphor for Italian actors connected through the movie industry, through this drugs mafia connection, that will never come out. So this is what he's saying. He's saying there's been a cover-up. In other interviews, he's basically said he could have done 18 months. He was offered 18 months if he'd roll on Tex. He didn't do it because he decided that he's not a snitch. I'm not saying that's admirable. I'm just saying that that's a fact.
Well, what happened to Tex?
Tex basically went over to Texas, and so he had a separate trial because he basically, his cousin was the chief of police there. Now, the Tex is very strange as well because immediately when he's in Texas, two high-priced lawyers from Beverly Hills called Walsh and DeLoach turn up and basically demand to see their client and show this record of how he's seen them 35 to 40 times in the last 6 months. But this is never again spoken about. And again, why is he seeing these lawyers and what on earth, how's he paying for this? Tex disavows any knowledge of them and basically sends them back. And he stays there with his cousin, who's the chief of police, and he's visited daily by his girlfriend and by his mum, who brings him dinner, right up until the point where he decides that they're going to extradite him over to LA when he becomes catatonic and has to be sent to a mental hospital. They basically determine that he's not catatonic, he's putting this on, and so they put him on trial. What's really weird about Texas trial is all that it does is they get Paul Watkins out, and he expands on the theory of Helter Skelter. So Tex Watson's trial is basically used to further flesh out the details or the seeming holes in the Helter Skelter story that have not been already covered in the Manson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, Van Houten trial. So basically, again, it's just a complete show for the public. Again, Tex basically gets life in prison. Well, they all get the death penalty, but it gets converted. An interesting statement that was made by Manson is that basically he keeps mentioning that Bugliosi's an old school Italian. He says this a lot and suggests that basically, he's in a position and a predicament where he's having to create this cover up. But what he says was that basically Bugliosi offered me sunshine if I would just go over to Geneva with him and play Helter Skelter. Now again, this sounds like the rantings of a madman, but he makes this connection to Geneva a couple of times in a few interviews, basically. What does Geneva sound like? Genovese. What he's suggesting there is that basically the mafia were pressing on Bugliosi and saying, the second our name comes up in this, you're dead. Make sure that everybody involved in this knows this is nothing to do with us, right? Okay? If you start talking about us, you're going to wind up dead. And this is it. Basically, Bugliosi's gone to Manson and gone, for Christ's sake, just go along with it. You can't get out of this. We're going to pin this on you, mate. Go along with it. It'll just be easier for everybody. You'll get a favor from these people. Right, afterwards. And Manson's gone, well, I'm not going to say anything, but this is ridiculous. Now, as we know, the trial was basically, there were 6 occasions where there should have been a mistrial. 6 occasions where there should have been a mistrial, like by any rational, logic. And then the defense never presented a case, which is ridiculous. Manson was allowed to make a speech but he wasn't allowed to make this speech to the jury because of his hypnotic powers. That's not a hyperbole. That is what the judge said. The judge said, because of your hypnotic powers, you can't speak to the jury.
So the whole thing that went down with the Sharon Tate killings and the other, was it 4 people?
Yeah.
So 5 of them total. This basically was and just stop me if I'm oversimplifying this, but it was a grudge type of killing based upon a drug deal.
Well, it wasn't supposed to be a killing. They were going to rob them because they were aggrieved at them. I don't think they ever intended to kill them. I think they intended to rob them. And the important point is that they didn't think that Sharon was there.
Okay, and they didn't think Sharon was there, and so then things went really south.
Yep.
Tex left 2 people alive, so Charles Manson, they came back. They made sure that the other 2 people had to disappear also.
Yep.
But what was it that the mob was concerned about, that this whole thing had to be made into some kind of circus? Was it that Manson and Tex had information that would expose the entire business of pornography, drugs, and so on?
Yeah, basically. It wasn't just the mob. Everybody had a vested interest. The problem was that all these things, Paramount Pictures, the LAPD, etc., they're all intertwined. Everybody had a vested interest in the truth not coming out. And basically because of the publicity of the case, and because essentially this 11-year-old lad found the gun and threatened to go to the newspapers if the police didn't give him his reward, because Peter Sellers and Warren Beatty and Yul Brynner had put up a reward of $25,000 for anybody that was interested in the case. This was split between Stephen Weiss, Danny DiCarlo got some, and Virginia Roberts and Connie Champagne were the 2 women that Susan Atkins told the story to in jail. They got some of it as well, although they later confessed to lying. Although they did actually, they confessed to lying during the trial. They confessed to basically making up and going along with Susan's story and elaborating on it in order to get this money at the behest of the lawyers, Richard Calabera and Caruso. And they confessed this to a gentleman called Robert Hendrickson, who later made a series of lurid documentaries about Manson, basically going along with the main story. Now, he knew the story was nonsense, and he probably felt a bit bad about this because he smuggled into court a newspaper which he gave to Manson that had the headline on it, Nixon declares Manson guilty, because Richard Nixon had said, this is ridiculous, this trial is blah, 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 blah. Manson is obviously guilty, and this became the headline. Manson flashed this to the jury, and this should have caused an immediate mistrial. Now, everybody apparently said that they were completely immune to that, and said that, it's fine, we can go on and still be a jury. So this was not taken into account. But numerous things like this happened during the case.
He was really involved in perhaps the underbelly of the beast, if you will. In other words, there were very high-powered people that were involved. There were celebrities involved. There were politicians involved. Perhaps there were police and law enforcement that were involved. And now you're telling me, I didn't know this, that Nixon got involved, which says that this thing went right up to the top.
Absolutely. And the other people that had a vested interest in being sort of taken out of the case were the Beach Boys, who had a direct connection to Manson. Who were their rivals at the time, at least in a commercial sense?
It was the Beatles.
Oh, yeah. What would be a perfect way to maneuver the attention away from the Beach Boys onto something far more spectacular? Particularly to a group of people who I don't think were in the country at that time in order to defend themselves.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point.
And I strongly believe that the entire Beatles connection came from Nick Grillo, who was the Beach Boys manager and also happened to be connected to the mafia. And as I say, I think that is part of the cover-up. And so what's happened with the Manson case is that essentially this cover-up started because so many people had so many vested interests, they all sort of put their own 2 penneth in. Church of Scientology, Hollywood, Paramount Pictures, the mafia, the prosecution, various people who wanted attention being attached to the case who've come up with like stories of many more murders and satanic rituals and stuff like that. And so the whole thing is just swirled into this incredible sort of like just nonsense with so many sort of like tentacles going off. So that's what I've hoped to do, is to sort of try and cut through all that chaff and go, okay, let's try and figure out what actually happened, what's a real plausible actual suggestion of what really went down, basically.
You know what this reminds me of, Neil? It reminds me a lot of the type of environment and circus atmosphere that was revolving around people like Jimmy Savile, where You had these pedophile rings and so on. And everything is done to make sure that what's really going down is never found out.
Yeah.
And there are roadblocks and obstacles and all that stuff that's put in place. And so then if some story becomes fabricated, and so Jimmy Savile, he becomes the focus of what was going on at a much grander scale, but they brought it right down to him. And the same thing they did with Manson.
That's a great example, actually, because they conducted the Jimmy Savile inquiry so poorly and so aggressively, basically dragging in loads of people, dragging them over the coals publicly, only then later to find out, well, actually, they didn't do anything, but we've ruined their reputation. Oh, they didn't do anything. And people like you and I will sat there and go, don't go for him, go for him, go to the Houses of Parliament. But they didn't do that. They had a public relations exercise whereby nobody could turn round in the mainstream and say they didn't investigate the Jimmy Savile thing. Of course we did, because we ruined so-and-so's career and Freddie Starr's career and John Peel's career and so-and-so's career, and they turned out to be innocent. You can't say that we didn't look into it. If anything, we were overzealous.
Yeah.
And that's exactly, you're very that's very astute of you, man. Like that's exactly what happened with the Manson thing. There's so many complicated bits to it that everybody's chasing the tail, looking at this lead, which is why, people spend so long looking at the process, because there's just enough to go, I found another lead. If I can only tie this together. And then when you realize it's not tied together, it's a nonsense that's ran through it as a red herring to detract you from the very nuts and bolts of the case, which is essentially it was a really grubby drug murder. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking. That's why I kept having to boil it down, because I was initially expecting something more complex, but as you were speaking, I'm thinking this is getting down to a drug murder.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that is exactly what the police initially thought. That is in all the initial police reports, that essentially this is a drug murder. The other thing that I expected, and again, people who've read my other books and stuff like that will probably have gone, I expected you to say mind control. I expected you to say government mind control. And you know what? When I went into this, I expected to say government mind control as well, because I thought it was an operation to essentially destroy the peace movement, tarnish the hippies with this brush of violence. Now, I don't discount that completely, because the reason that Manson became politicized, the reason that basically people were wearing T-shirts at his trial saying "Free Manson" and were suggesting that he was a sort of a class warrior and that this was a revolutionary act, was due to one person. Bernardine Van Doren of the Weathermen. In 1969, when the Weathermen decided to break away from the SDS and decide to move to more violent, anonymous action, basically becoming a terrorist organization against the oppressive government as they saw it, they declared 1969 the year of the fork, and Bernardine Van Doren basically made several inflammatory speeches at this particular event following the Days of Rage, praising the Manson murders and politicizing them, saying that essentially it was a revolutionary act in the way that they left a fork in the belly of Lino LaBianca. They killed those rich piggies and then ate dinner in the living room with them. She really, really, really sort of pushed it. And that, I think, is where the spark came from in order to connect this to a broader thing, because there's no doubt that Manson was used after the fact by the government, by the intelligence agencies, by the mainstream to demonize the peace movement, to demonize anyone with long hair, to demonize anybody that lives in a commune, to demonize anybody that took drugs. It was certainly used as a stick to beat people with, and I think it was because after the fact, I think the CIA basically, who were there with people like, Jolyon West and that, living in Haight-Ashbury, went, hey, look, they've given us lemons, let's make lemonade. Let's use this in a method that we can use. I don't think there's any evidence that Manson was mind-controlled before 1967, because none of the institutes that he was in have got any evidence that they were connected to mind control, particularly MK Ultra. And I don't think that he mind-controlled his followers, because the concept of using LSD in order to mind control people was not successfully achieved by the CIA. Other methods were, but the utilization of LSD was only used as a befuddlement agent. But what Manson was very adept at is, as we've mentioned before, mind control in a different sense, in the sense of being a pimp. And again, it's very simplistic, but when you boil it down to he's a pimp, you understand. Watch the girls talking about Charlie and imagine they're talking about a pimp. Then go and watch that documentary, Pimps Up, Hose Down, or Hookers at the Point, or any of those, and watch the way they talk about their pimps. It's frighteningly similar.
Yeah, this has been really an incredible conversation, Neil. And I tip my hat to you, because the level of information and how you have stitched this together is amazing. It's amazing. And the book is called "Now's the Only Thing That's Real."
Yeah.
Right?
That's a quote. I mean, this is quite fortuitous. It's a quote. It's actually a sample that is used in a Skinny Puppy song called Warlock. Now's the only thing that's real. But it comes from a much longer speech that was made by Manson, in which he basically says that you've got to sneak to get the truth. He's in prison at the time, and he's also almost sort of implying that basically the reality that's going to be presented in the case is not real, and that basically the truth is going to be hidden, and you're not going to get to it because people are going to obviously obfuscate it. Now, what's really, really curious about this is that basically the recording of Manson that is played back in the documentary and the sample that's used in that song isn't Manson. It's his words, but because when the gentleman who made the documentary, Robert Hendrickson, actually recorded it, the sound was really, really bad. So he got an actor to overlay that particular speech. So even in this speech where Manson is obliquely talking about a cover-up, there's a level of cover-up and a detachment from reality, which I felt was strangely apt in this particular case.
Yeah, convenient, right? I mean, so Neil, how do people purchase the book? Where can they purchase it?
Well, at the minute, it's just available from my website, which is neilsandersmindcontrol.com. It is a big book, so it's 564 pages. It's over 200,000 words. It's been sort of put together over a few years. So, and what I've tried to do, as I say, is weave together a coherent timeline and an explanation. You can read it if you know stuff about Manson. You can read it if you never heard about Manson. That's why in many ways it's so long, because I had to tell the official story and then unpick the official story and then tell the entire true story. And basically you'll get a complete history of Charles Manson's life, a complete examination of the crimes, a complete sort of examination of the theories, a debunking of a lot of the theories, and then a final explanation of the context and why the cover-up went into place, and what was involved in the cover-up, basically.
Well, let me tell you, Neil, it's always good to have you on the show. I always get emails, and they're saying, you need to get Neil back on the show to talk about whatever Neil likes to talk about, So, and this was really good. I was quiet, folks, because basically I knew the mainstream story about Charles Manson. I did do some research over the years to know enough, like I mentioned in the beginning of the show, that there were open ends to the story and that what we were told was probably not the truth. And so I was just like a listener, Neil. I was just listening and taking it all, and it was fascinating.
Well, thank you. I mean, sorry if I was rambling on a bit. I appreciate it's very complicated, so hopefully I've managed to sort of explain it in a way that people do understand it and sort of, again, understand the theory that I have behind it as well. So yeah, say if people are interested in it, either contact me on Facebook or go to my website and you can buy it there. But thanks, Mike. It's always a pleasure to chat to you, mate.
Oh, thank you so much, Neil. And you have a great evening. I know it's getting late there where you are, and I'll have the show out probably give me about 2 weeks.
Yeah, great. Sounds great.
And I'll send you a link.
All right. Thank you, man.
All right, my friend.
All right, take care.
Bye now. And that concludes another Sage of Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the show notes below. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can get to the blog by typing in sageofquayradio.blogspot.com or simply head over to our hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia. And remember, live in truth, and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.